The hidden truth. The town elder's secret. The night after the shadow attacked Father Richard, the town was in chaos. No one slept. Doors stayed locked. Candles burned in windows, though no one believed they could keep the darkness away. The town gathered in the church the next morning. The air was thick with fear. Everyone whispered the same question. What is haunting us? Mrs. Eleanor sat near the front, her hands shaking. Beside her, Father Richard still looked pale, his breathing heavy after the attack. The mayor stood at the altar, looking just as frightened as everyone else. Then the oldest man in town, Mr. Gregory, stood up. His wrinkled face was full of sorrow. "I know what is happening," he said. His voice was weak but steady. "And I should have told you all a long time ago." The church fell silent. Mr. Gregory sighed and lowered his head. "Many years ago, before most of you were born, this town did something terrible. Margaret's death." He took a deep breath, then continued. "There was a woman named Margaret. She was young, beautiful, and kind, but people feared her." "Why?" someone asked. "Because they believed she was a witch." Gasps filled the room. Mr. Gregory nodded. Strange things happened around her. Crops withered, animals died, people got sick. The town elders decided she was cursed. Mrs. Eleanor covered her mouth in shock. "One night, a group of men took her from her home," Mr. Gregory said, his voice shaking. "They dragged her to the old well." Tears filled his eyes. She begged them to let her go. She swore she had done nothing wrong, but they didn't listen. They beat her, tied her hands, and threw her into the well. The church was silent. No one moved. "She screamed for help," Mr. Gregory whispered, "but no one came." A cold chill swept through the room. It felt as if the air itself had turned heavy, thick with sorrow. The ritual that trapped her. The next morning, the town woke up to a terrible sight. Mr. Gregory continued. The ground around the well was soaked in blood. But Margaret's body was gone. People shuddered in fear. She was dead, he said, but her spirit was not. Strange things began to happen. The men who had killed her started dying, one by one. Some vanished without a trace. Others were found in their beds, their faces frozen in terror. The town knew Margaret's spirit was taking revenge. Desperate, the elders called upon an old priest. He performed a powerful ritual, sealing Margaret's spirit inside the well. He warned the town never to disturb it. "For years we were safe," Mr. Gregory whispered. "But now," he looked at the mayor. "The construction," the mayor whispered. Everyone turned to look at him. "A few months ago, we started digging near the well to expand the town," he explained. "The workers broke into the old stone around it. They didn't know." A deep silence filled the church. The seal had been broken. Margaret was free, and she wanted revenge. The possession. That night, the town fell into terror. Doors locked, windows shut. No one dared step outside. Then at exactly midnight, the laughter returned. It was louder this time, stronger. It echoed through the streets, slipping into homes like a cold breath against the skin. But this time it didn't stop. In a small house near the church, a little girl named Lily sat up in bed. She was only 10 years old, with bright blonde hair and big blue eyes. Her parents had tried to comfort her for days, telling her there was nothing to be afraid of. But tonight, she wasn't afraid. She was smiling. Her mother, Sarah, woke up to the sound of giggling. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. Lily stood by the window, staring out into the night. Sarah frowned. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Lily didn't turn around. Her tiny shoulders shook with laughter. Sarah's heart pounded. "Lily?" Slowly, her daughter turned to face her. Sarah's blood ran cold. Lily's bright blue eyes were gone. In their place were empty black voids, endless, hungry, and hollow. Her lips curled into a wide, unnatural grin. Then, in a voice that was not her own, she whispered, "You will all pay." Sarah screamed. Terror spreads. Lily's father rushed into the room, his face pale. "What's wrong?" Sarah pointed at their daughter, shaking. "Something's wrong with her." Lily tilted her head, her grin never fading. "I see you," she whispered. Then the room went cold. The lights flickered and the windows slammed open. A gust of icy wind howled through the house. Lily's father grabbed her shoulders. "Lily, snap out of it!" Lily let out a sharp, shrieking laugh. Then with impossible strength, she shoved him across the room. He crashed into the wall, gasping. Sarah sobbed, backing away. "Please stop." But Margaret took a step forward. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was a hiss, sharp and filled with rage. "They thought they could get rid of me," she said. "They thought I would stay buried." Lily's body twitched unnaturally, her limbs bending at odd angles. "But now," she let out another sharp laugh, "now they will suffer." Then the bedroom lights burst, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah screamed. Outside, the town clock struck midnight, and Margaret's laughter filled the night. Midnight terror, vanishing at midnight. The night after Lily's possession, fear gripped Willow Creek like a choking hand. No one left their homes. No one spoke of what was happening, but deep down, everyone knew one thing. Margaret was hunting, and she was just getting started. At exactly midnight, the screams began. The first was Mr. Dawson, the grocer. His neighbors heard the sound of his front door creaking open. Then came the frantic footsteps, the rustling of curtains, the slam of furniture being knocked over. Then a blood-curdling scream. By the time the police arrived, his house was empty. His bed was untouched. His shoes were still by the door. But Mr. Dawson was gone. All that remained was his reflection in the mirror, twisted in horror, mouth wide open in a silent, eternal scream. By dawn, 4 more people had vanished. The town was drowning in fear, shadows in the dark. People locked their doors, boarded their windows, huddled together, hoping the night would pass without another disappearance. But the shadows had learned how to slip inside. They crept through cracks under doors, slithered through keyholes, stretched along walls. Mrs. Harper, the school teacher, sat in her rocking chair, clutching a rosary. She hadn't slept in days. Then she felt it. A breath, cold and sharp, right against her ear. Her hands trembled as she turned her head. A shadow moved across the wall, stretching, twisting. Then a whisper. "Why did you let them kill me?" Her heart nearly stopped. "Who's there?" she whispered. The rocking chair creaked. Then slowly, the shadow peeled itself from the wall. It was tall, thin, long fingers stretching toward her. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting flowers. Mrs. Harper tried to scream, but a cold hand clamped over her mouth. By morning, she was gone, the priest's last hope. Father Richard knew there was only one way to stop this. Margaret had possessed Lily. She was using the girl as a vessel, a doorway to the world of the living. If he could exorcise her spirit, maybe, just maybe, he could break her hold. The priest stood before Lily, who sat tied to a chair in the church. She wasn't struggling, she wasn't crying, she was smiling. Her once bright blue eyes were now deep, empty voids. Her small hands rested calmly in her lap, but her nails were blackened as if burned from the inside. Father Richard took a deep breath, gripping his Bible. "In the name of God," he began, "I command you, spirit, to leave this child." Lily giggled. "God?" she whispered. "Where was God when they threw me into the well?" Father Richard's hands trembled. He sprinkled holy water on Lily's forehead. Her body jerked violently, her mouth twisted open in a silent scream, and her eyes rolled back. The church walls trembled, the candles flickered wildly. Then an invisible force slammed into Father Richard, knocking him back. He gasped as a cold, unseen grip tightened around his throat. The air grew heavy, pressing down on his chest like a great weight. His breath came in short, desperate gasps. Lily's body twitched, and then, in a voice that echoed from deep within, Margaret spoke. "You cannot stop me, priest." The grip tightened. Father Richard's vision blurred. He clawed at his neck, but there was nothing there, only the crushing force of invisible hands. "Lily, no," Margaret grinned. "You think your prayers can save them?" she hissed. "You think he is listening?" Father Richard's strength was fading. His vision darkened, his lungs burned. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure vanished. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Lily blinked, her head tilting. "You're not strong enough," she said softly. Then she laughed. A cold, cruel laugh that echoed through the empty church. Margaret's true form. The temperature dropped. The candles blew out. A thick mist curled around the church floor. Then she appeared. Margaret. She stepped forward, pale and thin, her dress soaked in old dried blood. Her long, tangled hair dripped with dark water. Her eyes were empty black pits, hollow and endless, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and death. Father Richard could not move. Margaret smiled. "I have waited so long," she whispered, "for justice, for revenge." She stepped past him, her bare feet leaving wet, dark footprints on the church floor. Then she stopped. Her head turned slowly. Her dark eyes locked onto someone in the crowd. An old man, trembling in the back of the church. "William Carter!" Margaret's lips curled into a wicked smile. "You!" she whispered. William's face turned white. "No," he gasped, shaking his head. "No, please." Margaret took a step forward. "You are the last," she whispered. "The last of them." Tears filled William's eyes. He fell to his knees, sobbing. "It wasn't me. It was my grandfather. I wasn't even born." Margaret's empty eyes stared into his soul. "It does not matter," she said. William let out a choked sob, his hands shaking. Margaret raised one hand. Her fingers stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward him. The air around her shimmered with something dark, something ancient. William tried to crawl back, but his body wouldn't move. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. "You will pay," Margaret whispered. Then the church doors slammed shut. The candles burned out, and William Carter let out a scream that would haunt the town forever.